Welcome back. If you've been following this war for even a week, you already know the rhythm by now. Something happens in the Strait of Hormuz, the Americans hit back, the IRGC throws a tantrum across 3 or 4 countries, and then everybody goes back to pretending they're negotiating in good faith. That's the loop we're stuck in right now. And today, with a funeral running in Tehran and a shaky truce hanging by a thread, that loop is exactly where the whole region is standing. Let's get you caught up properly, because the last stretch of this conflict has been one of the most dangerous sequences since the war started back in February. It started, like it always seems to, with a ship. An Iranian drone slammed into a Singapore-registered container vessel called the Ever Lovely, as it tried to use the southern route along the Omani coast, the exact corridor the ceasefire agreement was supposed to protect. That single strike was enough to make the United Nations pause its own evacuation program for the ships and sailors still stranded in the Gulf, 11,000 mariners who thought they were finally getting out. Less than 24 hours later, it happened again. This time it was a Panama-flagged tanker called the Kiku, hauling more than 2 million barrels of crude, hit by another one-way attack drone in almost the same stretch of water. 2 strikes on 2 commercial vessels within a single day, in the exact corridor Iran itself had agreed, on paper, to keep open for at least 60 days without incident. You can only get hit twice before someone stops calling it an accident. CENTCOM's answer came fast. American aircraft struck 10 separate targets inside Iran, hitting locations at Sirik, Bandar-e Lengeh, and Qeshm Island, all of them sitting right along the southern approaches to the strait, the exact geography controlling who gets to move through that waterway and who doesn't. The strikes weren't random. They hit radar installations, missile platforms, drone storage sites, and facilities used to prepare naval mines, the actual physical toolkit Iran has been using for months to choke that corridor whenever it feels like flexing. And here's the detail that tells you everything about how deliberate this was. The United States didn't just hit once and call it a day. Within 90 minutes, the target list grew from 4 locations to 10. That's not a single retaliatory strike. That's an escalating real-time expansion of the target set, which tells you the people running this operation had authority to keep adding targets as the mission unfolded, rather than waiting for a fresh round of sign-offs every time they wanted to hit something new. Iran's answer arrived within a day, and it was, without exaggeration, the most geographically spread-out response Tehran has launched against American assets since this entire war began back in February. The IRGC didn't pick 1 target, they picked 5, spread across 3 different countries, Ali al-Salam and Ahmad al-Jaber air bases in Kuwait, Sheikh Isa Air Base in Bahrain, the headquarters of the U.S. 5th Fleet in Bahrain, and Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the forward headquarters of the entire United States Central Command in the region. Let that last one sit for a second. Not a random outpost, not a fuel depot, the actual forward command headquarters for every American military operation across this entire theater. If you wanted to send a message that you're willing to reach for the single most symbolically loaded target available to you, that's the one you pick. The good news, and it is genuinely good news, is that the Pentagon reported no American casualties and no significant damage to any of the targeted installations. Whatever air defense architecture the United States has spent the last several months building across the Gulf, it did exactly what it was supposed to do, and it did it against a genuinely large multi-front attack rather than a single isolated missile someone could dismiss as an easy intercept. Ballistic missiles and drones came in across 5 sites in 3 countries, and functionally, none of it landed where it was supposed to. That's not luck. That's layers of Aegis-equipped destroyers, Patriot batteries, and Allied air defense systems working in coordination across an enormous stretch of geography, on a night when Iran threw a genuinely large-scale multi-front attack at them. Iran, of course, framed the whole thing very differently. Officials from the Revolutionary Guard described the American strikes on their own territory as a flagrant breach of the ceasefire, while simultaneously describing their own missile and drone barrage against 3 sovereign countries as a proportional and justified response. If you're having trouble following the logic there, don't worry, it's not you. Iran's public position throughout this entire war has consistently been that anything done to them is an act of aggression, and anything they do to anyone else is self-defense. It's a framework that only makes sense if you already assume you're the only party in the conflict entitled to have grievances. Gulf states didn't buy it. Bahrain's government came out directly, describing the Iranian attacks on its territory as a blatant violation of sovereignty and a threat to the security of its own citizens and residents. Kuwait condemned it. Qatar quietly absorbed a strike on the literal nerve center of American military coordination in the region without losing a single American life, which is either a remarkable stroke of luck or a genuine testament to how seriously regional air defense has been taken since this war began. And underneath all of that noise, Iran doubled down on the actual root of this entire dispute, the strait itself. In the same breath as claiming credit for hitting 3 countries, Iranian military officials warned that any vessel failing to comply with routes announced by Tehran would be dealt with more forcefully going forward, and that Iran considers its grip on that waterway to be a strategic deterrent against the United States rather than simply a revenue play, which is an interesting thing to insist on. Right after your negotiators have also been telling reporters they intend to start charging tolls the moment the ceasefire's toll-free window runs out in mid-August. You don't get to claim something is purely about strategic deterrence and also announce your pricing plan for it in the same news cycle. Oman, to its credit, tried to lower the temperature by offering a temporary free maritime corridor coordinated with the International Maritime Organization, an attempt to give commercial shipping some kind of safe lane that isn't entirely dependent on Iran's mood that particular week. It's a patch, not a fix, but patches matter when there are still thousands of sailors and hundreds of vessels trying to get in or out of that Gulf every single day. Other regional players have been quietly hedging their own bets throughout this entire conflict, aware that a war this unpredictable doesn't respect borders on a map. Saudi Arabia has repeatedly signaled it's prepared to use its own military force against Iranian incursions into its airspace or waters, while keeping its own territory closed to American and Israeli aircraft launching strikes, a careful balancing act designed to avoid becoming a direct target without appearing to fully align with either side. Britain has floated the idea of allowing American forces to use British bases for what it specifically called defensive strikes, while also sending specialists to help Gulf partners counter Iranian drone attacks, a distinction that matters enormously to countries trying to support the coalition without technically joining offensive operations against Iranian soil. Even NATO assets have gotten pulled into this, intercepting Iranian drones and missiles that strayed near Turkish airspace, a reminder that a conflict centered on a 34-kilometer stretch of water has already reached out and touched the airspace of a NATO member state more than once. Now, here's where this gets genuinely strange, because instead of that exchange spiraling into round 3, round 4, an endless tit-for-tat that eventually drags both sides back into full-scale war, both governments did something that feels almost surreal given what had just happened. They sat back down at the table. Indirect talks resumed in Doha, mediated through Qatari and Pakistani officials, because Washington and Tehran still refused to negotiate face-to-face, even after months of this. President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, were both on the ground meeting with Qatar's emir, laying groundwork for technical-level discussions that, by any honest description, barely touched the hardest parts of this conflict. 2 full days of meetings, and the actual agenda stayed almost entirely focused on shipping traffic through the Strait and the roughly $6 billion of Iran's own frozen assets sitting in Qatari accounts. Iran's nuclear program, the actual reason the war started in the first place back in February, barely came up. Vice President Vance himself admitted as much publicly, saying only that the nuclear issue was something they were going to start talking about at some undefined point in the future. Qatar's foreign ministry described the outcome as positive progress, which is one of those diplomatic phrases that sounds reassuring right up until you realize it's being used to describe 2 days of talks that avoided the single most dangerous unresolved question of the entire war. President Trump, for his part, tried to strike a note of cautious optimism afterward, telling reporters that Iran had come a long way and that, despite everything, the two sides were getting along very well, a phrase that landed a little awkwardly given that, less than a week earlier, American aircraft had been striking targets inside Iran, and Iranian missiles had been hitting American-linked bases in 3 separate countries. Markets, at least, seemed to take the optimism at face value. Oil prices dropped to their lowest level in roughly 4 months following those comments, and several analysts trimmed their price forecasts for the first time since the war began back in February. But optimism from a podium and reality on the water are 2 very different things, and the very same week those talks were happening, Iranian state television ran a story about a foreign container ship running aground in shallow water, specifically because, according to their own reporting, the vessel had strayed off Iran's designated shipping route. No ship name given, no flag confirmed, just a vague, perfectly timed anecdote that reinforces exactly the narrative Iran wants reinforced. Stray from our lanes, and bad things happen to you, sometimes seemingly without Tehran lifting a finger at all. And just 2 days ago, completely independent of anything happening in Doha, Iran's own Joint Military Command issued a fresh, blunt warning, telling every commercial vessel in the region that failing to follow Tehran-designated routes through the strait would be met with what they called an immediate and firm response from Iran's armed forces. Not the IRGC hiding behind plausible deniability. The actual Joint Military Command, on the record, days after 2 full days of positive progress in Doha. In that same statement, they went further, specifically calling out the continued presence of American fighter aircraft patrolling over the strait, describing it as something that endangers regional security, and vowing that Iran will not hesitate to act against what they characterized as American aggression or interference in the waterway. So, within roughly 48 hours of 2 governments shaking hands, metaphorically, over positive progress, One of those governments issued a direct threat against the exact military assets sitting there to enforce the peace they just spent 2 days discussing. That's not the behavior of a country that's finished escalating. That's the behavior of a country buying time while it looks tough enough at home to survive its own internal politics. And those internal politics are genuinely chaotic right now, more than most Western coverage is giving credit for. Iran is currently in the middle of burying Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, killed in the opening strikes of this war back in February, with funeral processions scheduled across Tehran, Mashhad, and parts of Iraq running from today through July 9th. His son, Mojtaba Khamenei, was installed as the new supreme leader within about a week of his father's death, reportedly under significant pressure from the Revolutionary Guard to move fast and avoid a power vacuum during an active war. That succession alone would be a massive story in a normal year. A father-to-son transfer of the most powerful religious and political office in the country, something the Islamic Republic has never actually done before, pushed through in days instead of the deliberate, secretive process the system was originally built around. And it hasn't exactly gone smoothly. Reports out of Iran note that Mojtaba Khamenei didn't even appear at his own father's 40th day memorial commemoration, with some foreign outlets citing possible health complications. On top of that, the actual burial itself has been delayed for months, well past the point Shiite tradition typically calls for, which multiple Iranian analysts and diaspora groups have pointed to as a sign of real internal crisis rather than simple logistics. When a government can't even manage to bury its own former leader on a normal timeline, that tells you something about how much bandwidth that government actually has left for anything else, including keeping its own military factions in line during a live shooting war. That's the backdrop you need to hold in your head every time you hear Iranian officials threatening immediate and firm responses against shipping or promising to hit American bases more forcefully next time. A leadership structure that just went through an unprecedented, rushed, internally contested succession, trying to project total strength to its own population while simultaneously negotiating over boat schedules and frozen bank accounts behind closed doors in Doha. That combination, a wounded government terrified of looking weak at exactly the moment it's most vulnerable, is precisely the kind of pressure that produces unpredictable, disproportionate reactions rather than careful, rational ones. Go back to how this succession actually happened, because it matters for understanding what's driving decisions right now. Under Iran's own constitution, the supreme leader is supposed to be selected by the Assembly of Experts, a body of roughly 88 senior clerics, through a process that's normally slow, secretive, and deliberate. When Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed in the opening strikes back in February, there was no officially designated successor, no formal heir, nothing on paper. A 3-person interim council took over in the immediate aftermath, made up of the country's president, its chief justice, and a senior cleric, just to keep the machinery of government technically running while the assembly worked out who came next. Except reporting at the time described the Revolutionary Guard actively pressuring members of that assembly to move fast and to move toward Mojtaba Khamenei specifically, with sources describing repeated contacts and what was characterized as psychological and political pressure applied to clerics who might otherwise have taken the usual months to deliberate. Within about a week, the decision was made. A father-to-son transfer of the most powerful office in the Islamic Republic, something the system was explicitly designed to avoid, because handing that role down like a monarchy is exactly the kind of hereditary rule the 1979 revolution was supposed to have ended forever. That's not a footnote. That's the single most important thing to understand about who is actually making decisions inside Iran right now. If the country's most powerful religious and political office got installed under military pressure rather than the normal clerical process, then the question of who really holds leverage over whom, whether it's Mojtaba Khamenei directing the IRGC or the IRGC quietly directing him, isn't settled. And a leadership arrangement with that much internal ambiguity is not a leadership arrangement built for careful, centrally coordinated restraint every time a naval commander somewhere along the coast decides to launch a drone at a passing tanker, because nobody outside that inner circle, and possibly nobody fully inside it either, can say with confidence who actually has the authority to say no. Layer onto that the sheer scale of what this war has already cost, on every side, because context matters here too. International monitoring groups tracking the conflict have documented casualties running into the thousands across multiple provinces inside Iran, including children killed in strikes on residential areas, alongside American service members injured in Iranian missile and drone attacks on regional bases, and civilian deaths in Israel from Iranian retaliatory strikes as well. This isn't a bloodless standoff being fought entirely through press releases and truth social posts. It's a war that has already killed real people on every side of it, and every fresh round of strikes and counterstrikes adds directly to that toll, even during the stretches when both governments are simultaneously telling reporters that talks are going very well. Let's talk about what's actually sitting in that theater right now, because the hardware tells its own story independent of anything anyone says in a press conference. An American aircraft carrier strike group has been operating in the Arabian Sea for weeks now, a floating airbase capable of projecting fighter coverage across the entire Gulf region within minutes of any incident. Around it, Arleigh Burke-class destroyers running the Aegis combat system, arguably the single most integrated naval air defense network that exists anywhere on the planet, purpose-built to shred incoming drones and cruise missiles before they ever reach a target. When Iran launched that 5-site, 3-country barrage in response to the American strikes, it was systems like these, layered with land-based Patriot batteries and allied air defense assets, that turned what could have been a mass casualty event into a night where the Pentagon reported 0 American deaths and no meaningful damage. Above the water, American fighter squadrons have kept up patrols over the southern shipping corridor, the exact route Iran keeps trying to intimidate vessels away from. These aircraft carry laser-guided rocket pods designed to knock small drones out of the sky for a fraction of the cost of a traditional air-to-air missile, and precision-guided munitions capable of hitting the exact buildings where drone and missile operations are actually being coordinated from. That's not incidental capability, that's the United States quietly signaling, without needing to say it out loud in a statement, that the next response wouldn't just be about shooting down whatever Iran launches. It would be about eliminating the ability to launch it again. Attack helicopters have been doing the unglamorous, essential work of hunting Iran's smaller and cheaper threats, the fast attack speedboats and one-way drones that make up the bulk of what's left of Iran's naval capability after months of a war that has already sunk warships and submarines and destroyed a significant chunk of its conventional fleet. Iran doesn't have the blue water navy it used to project. What it has now is speed, numbers, and desperation, a swarm-based approach that relies on volume rather than firepower. And against that specific kind of threat, a handful of well-equipped attack helicopters with the right sensors and munitions represents a genuinely lopsided advantage. None of that means this is easy or risk-free for the American side either. Air defense at this scale is expensive. Sustained operations put enormous strain on ships, aircrews, and logistics chains that have already been running at wartime tempo since February. And every single intercepted missile or drone is still a missile or drone that had to be tracked, engaged, and destroyed correctly, under real pressure, in real time, with real consequences if any layer of that defense had failed even once. The fact that it worked on the night Iran hit 5 sites across 3 countries doesn't guarantee it works the same way next time, especially if Iran adapts its tactics, increases volume further, or times this future attack to exploit exactly the kind of transition period like right now during a funeral, mid-negotiation, when everyone's attention is split. There's also a quieter economic dimension to all of this that rarely makes it into the headlines about missiles and warships. Every month, this strait operates below its normal capacity is a month where the global energy market absorbs a real cost, and that cost hasn't landed evenly. Strategic analysis of the broader disruption has pointed out that China, notably absent from any of the diplomatic tracks trying to resolve this, has emerged as one of the primary beneficiaries of the chaos, better positioned than most Asian economies to absorb and reroute around a closure that's hit everyone else's supply chains far harder. While American carriers, destroyers, and fighter squadrons burn fuel and flight hours trying to force this waterway back towards something resembling normal, the country picking up the largest share of the resulting economic slack isn't a party to the ceasefire, isn't attending the Doha talks, and has no obligation to help resolve any of it. So where does that leave things today, on the day this funeral procession actually begins winding through Tehran? The honest answer is suspended, not resolved. Commercial shipping through the strait has partially recovered from the near-total collapse it suffered when the war started, but it's still running at a fraction of pre-war volume, somewhere in the range of 1/3 of normal traffic on a good day, still subject to Iranian route restrictions, still occasionally disrupted by GPS interference that nobody has fully explained or stopped. The demining question, the actual physical mines Iran laid across parts of that waterway months ago, remains unresolved too, with European countries offering help that Iran hasn't fully accepted, leaving the literal safety of the water itself tangled up in the same diplomatic gridlock as everything else. Iran's own negotiators have been explicit that once the ceasefire's 60-day toll-free window expires in mid-August, they intend to start charging vessels to pass through, whether the rest of the world recognizes their legal right to do that or not. That's a little over 6 weeks from today. Every warning about designated routes, every drone strike dressed up as ceasefire management, every burst of tough rhetoric about American aircraft endangering regional security, is functionally Iran establishing operational precedent before that clock runs out, so that by the time mid-August arrives, charging those tolls looks less like a new provocation and more like the continuation of something everyone's already grudgingly adjusted to. And that's exactly the precedent the United States and its Gulf partners keep insisting they will not accept. America's own Secretary of State has been blunt about it in meetings with Gulf Arab foreign ministers, warning that if the world lets Iran get away with charging fees on an international waterway simply because it happens to border Iranian territory, that idea doesn't stay contained to the Strait of Hormuz. It spreads to every other strategic choke point on the planet: the Bab el-Mandeb, the Bosphorus, the Strait of Malacca, anywhere a country with a coastline decides its geography entitles it to a toll booth. Nobody involved in this actually wants a full return to the kind of large-scale war that opened this conflict back in February. Iran doesn't want it because it just went through the most chaotic leadership transition in its modern history and can't afford a renewed direct confrontation with the American military while it's still trying to consolidate power internally, evidenced by a supreme leader who couldn't even attend his own father's memorial service. The United States doesn't want it because gas prices, a fragile ceasefire, and the political cost of reigniting a full war right before the midterms are exactly the kind of variables no administration wants sitting on the table heading into an election year. And it's worth widening the lens for a second, because the Strait isn't the only front where this ceasefire is being tested right now. In Lebanon, the government has been trying to move forward on an agreement with Israel that would require disarming Hezbollah, a group that isn't just a militia sitting on the border, but one that's embedded directly inside Lebanon's own parliament and political system. Hezbollah's own representatives have publicly vowed to block any implementation of that agreement, insisting they will not lay down their weapons regardless of what the Lebanese government signs on to, while accusing Washington of undermining separate Pakistani-mediated talks on the broader regional framework. That standoff has already produced unrest in Beirut and in towns across southern Lebanon, with supporters of the group blocking roads and clashing with security forces over an agreement that exists, for now, only on paper. Israel, for its part, has made clear it isn't waiting patiently for that disarmament to happen through persuasion alone. Officials have said plainly that if progress stalls, Israeli forces will maintain their presence in the security zone they currently hold in southern Lebanon, rather than withdraw on any promised timeline, and that operations against Hezbollah are expected to continue for months, regardless of how the diplomatic track unfolds. With elections approaching in Israel and midterms approaching in the United States, every government involved in this wider conflict, American, Israeli, and Iranian alike, is making decisions with one eye on a domestic political clock that has nothing to do with the actual military situation on the ground, and everything to do with how strong each leader needs to look to their own voters in the coming months. That's the real danger sitting underneath all of this. Not one single flashpoint that could reignite the war, but several running in parallel: the Strait, Lebanon, the unresolved nuclear file, each one capable of blowing up the ceasefire on its own, each one being managed by leaders under intense domestic pressure to look tough rather than look accommodating, at exactly the moment genuine restraint would matter most. But nobody wants it has never once been the same thing as nobody's building toward it. And everything happening on the ground right now, the fresh route warnings, the toll deadline sitting 6 weeks out, the American carrier group parked and ready, the Iranian military publicly threatening the exact aircraft enforcing the peace, says the drift is still toward escalation, not away from it. The real question nobody can answer with any confidence right now is what happens once these funeral processions conclude on July 9th, and Iran's new, still shaky leadership has to actually decide how to govern rather than just how to bury its predecessor. Does a supreme leader who needed IRGC pressure just to get installed and who reportedly couldn't manage to show up at his own father's memorial have the internal authority to rein in the exact hardline factions that keep launching drones at commercial ships in the name of ceasefire management? Or does he need those factions more than they need him, which would mean the drone strikes, the route warnings, and the tit-for-tat exchanges with American forces aren't an aberration at all, but simply the new operating procedure for however long this ceasefire limps along? Nobody sitting in Doha, Washington, or whatever room Iran's actual power now gets decided in can tell you that with any real confidence. And that uncertainty is exactly why every insurer pricing a policy for a ship transiting that strait this week is still treating the ceasefire like it could collapse without warning, why every captain routing through that corridor is recalculating risk with every single transit, and why the next drone strike, whenever and wherever it happens, isn't going to be treated as some shocking outlier. It's going to be treated as exactly what it's been every single time so far: the next data point in a pattern nobody involved has actually figured out how to stop. Think about what that actually means for the people whose job it is to price this risk for a living. War risk insurance premiums for vessels transiting the strait spiked dramatically the moment the war began, and even with the ceasefire technically in place, those premiums haven't fully come back down to where they sat before February. Insurers don't price policies based on press conferences. They price them based on patterns, and the pattern over the last several months has been unmistakable. A strike, a pause, a round of hopeful diplomatic language, and then another strike. Every underwriter watching this conflict knows that pattern by now, and every shipping company deciding whether to risk the southern route instead of adding weeks and fuel costs to sail around the entire continent of Africa is making that calculation with the same pattern in mind. And then there's the funeral itself, which deserves to be understood as more than just a somber news item happening in the background. In the Islamic Republic's 50-plus year history, the transfer of ultimate religious and political authority has only happened once before, when Ruhollah Khomeini died in 1989, and Ali Khamenei was named his successor within a single day. This time, the process took roughly a week under wartime conditions, following an assassination rather than a natural death. And the burial itself has now been delayed for months past when tradition would typically call for it. Every day the funeral gets pushed back is another day analysts inside and outside Iran read as evidence that the regime is still working out exactly how fragile its own position has become. And every day of visible internal uncertainty is another day the hardline factions who pushed hardest for this succession have every incentive to keep proving their toughness through exactly the kind of drone strikes and route warnings that keep landing this conflict back on your screen. 6 weeks from today, that toll deadline hits. And whatever Iran's leadership looks like once the funeral dust settles is going to decide whether the back half of this year looks like slow, grinding, occasionally tense negotiation, or looks like February all over again, except this time with a government even less predictable than the one that started it.